Hello, I'm Maya. I'm an artist here at Media Molecule. In this masterclass, I'll be showing you some of my personal techniques, tips, and tricks for creating exciting levels and scenes in dreams. Inspired by making the ancient times kit and scenes, I'll be making a stylized set using a mixture of pre-made and custom-designed elements, paying special attention to lighting and grading. This masterclass will teach you how to roughly lay out a scene, light and grade to create a cool atmosphere, and paint and modify assets to finish it off. I've made a small character with a cartoonish appearance, so my design doesn't want to feel too realistic. This means I can push my design choices in a more fun and playful direction. I've also made a collection of some of my pre-made elements that you can use to build your scene quickly. I'll be using the paint and sculpt modes a lot throughout this masterclass, so if you're not that familiar with those modes, check out some of our tutorials, which will get you up to speed. Feel free to create with me or just sit back and watch me work. When you're ready, press the arrow on the video to move to the next step. Before I start creating anything, I like to set up a base look for the scene with two gadgets, sun and sky and grade and effects. I do this now because I like to see how my scene will look while I'm building, rather than waiting until it's complete. First, I'll make a simple rectangle at right angles to the floor to see how my changes affect the colors, shadows, and general look of the scene. The rectangle casts a shadow and has one side in shade and one side in direct light. This allows me to see how the changes I make affect the light and dark parts of the image. I tweak the sun and sky gadget to get a feeling of sunset or dusk, as I'm going for a darker setting. This means making the sun quite orange and lowering its position so that it casts longer shadow. I change the sky flick type and give the sky a pinkish hue. Also, to create a cinematic look, I use a microchip with true wiper gadgets, which imitates black bars at the top and bottom of the screen. I use this because I really like the widescreen look, and it helps me focus on what is on screen all the time when creating. This is a technique I've brought over from my experience of drawing digitally. You can also find this simple black bars element in the collection if you want to use it too. Now I do a loose pass on the grade using the grade and effects gadget I added earlier. Grading is the art of manipulating the look of an image by changing the contrast, tone, and color in a way that affects everything in the image. It's a great way to change the atmosphere of a scene in a few simple steps. Most images you see, whether in movies, television, or photography, have been graded. Sometimes it's subtle, and sometimes it's really obvious. I adjust the grain, lens flare, bloom, and vignette strength. The vignette focuses the viewer's eye towards the center of the screen. It's a neat way to direct a player's attention. Experiment with the grade and effects gadget to create a look you like too. Now I've got a rough grading and lighting setup. I like to create a palette that I work from as I sculpt and paint. Having a predefined set of colors that work together really helps the art direction. For this scene, I've chosen a selection of pastel colors to work from. I simply make a few flattened cubes and tint each one a color that I like. I group them together so I can move them around the scene as needed. As I work, I use the color picker to select colors from the palette before painting or sculpting new objects, much like an artist would when painting. When in sculpt mode, paint mode, or code mode, you can shortcut to the color picker by pressing the touchpad button on your wireless controller. Then simply press X over the color you would like to use. If you're using the motion controllers like me, simply tap the sphere on your primary controller to the base of your secondary controller to activate the color picker. Then hover your primary imp over the color on the palette you would like to use and press X on your primary controller to select it. This isn't limited to your color palette. You can select colors from any part of your scene. Now I have a base look set up. I'll start laying out my scene in the next step. Press the arrow on the video player when you're ready to move on. Now we're going to lay out our scene. We call this making a white box. A white box is like making a skeleton structure that we'll build upon. I'll start by sculpting buildings using smear or stamp shape. I've added some buildings to the collection if you'd like to stamp them in too. Think about how you can modify them by scoping in and editing each one to your liking. To get that natural look, you'll notice I don't use the grid, relying more on my eye to create cuts and stamps. I tend to make things quite wonky and not super straight. For instance, making this simple wall with a recessed arch. Just as in real life, there's usually a lot of unevenness in things, which actually can help make the scene look more real. At least in these stylized scenes that I tend to make, I rarely make anything that's exactly symmetrical and sharp. While I'm sculpting, I like to think about where a character could explore. These could be alleyways, narrow streets, or stairs to a raised level of the scene. I move my view around where the scene camera will be, visualizing the buildings around me. That way I can make the scene feel as I want it to for the player. This usually means having smaller, more detailed structures close to the playable area, with larger, less detailed elements further away. Finally, I'll add a floor to my scene. You can find one I've made in the collection. First, I'll switch on Stay Upright so that the floor stays level, and then stamp it in the scene. I'll clone them around to fill up the floor area. I'm happy with the white box scene now, so in the next step we'll start adding some detail. When you're ready, go to the next step. Now I'll start adding detail to my creations. Using a color from my palette, I'll make a sign above this doorway. I like to use the mirror guide to quickly cut away at sculptures and create the shape I like. I use a hard-edged shape set to subtract and in a dark color to cut into the sign and give it a handcrafted look. Then I'll add smaller details with shapes set to add to create a motif before I begin to paint. By using paint mode with surface snap, as well as tweaking the finish, impasto and ruffle, I can paint over the sculptures as I would in a drawing or painting. For me, that's really fun, as I love drawing, and using this technique, I can imitate the way I would make a set in a drawing or an asset. It's a fun mix between 2D and 3D. Making this first custom piece in my scene has given me some ideas about the design choices I'll make in the next steps. When you're ready, press the arrow on the video player to move on to the next step. Now that I have a base for the architecture and layout of my scene, I'll start building on it with elements from the collection. Following the lines of the architecture and spaces that have been created, I stamp my assets into place, fine-tuning as I go. Assets can be edited, cloned, and painted on to create new and interesting details. I love seeing how one small item can become several varied elements in the scene. Remember, you can scope into and edit any items you find in my collection, or even the Dreamiverse. I'll use different flecks to paint the area between the wooden frames to add texture, color, and detail. I really like using paint mode to create physical elements with strokes. These are especially useful with the default heavy fleck in creating wall structures. I won't be too precious about my decisions here, as they'll probably change later. But having most of the white box elements dressed will be handy before we move on to the next step. Continue stamping elements from the collection and look for interesting ways to modify them into bespoke pieces. When you're ready, move on to the next step. Now I'll do some detailing on my structures, starting with that arched doorway I built earlier. I'll scope in and start by creating some brickwork to form the arch. I roughly matched the shape with a cylinder with a hole in it, sectioned in half. My scene already has some decoration which can be a bit distracting when sculpting. So I used the Hide Everything Else button from the context menu. This lets me focus on my sculpture and see around my other objects that may be blocking my view. Once I've added my detail, I can use this element to create walls and structures of the same style. This is really simple now that we've made our main arch asset. I delete the subtract edits that formed the arch. Then I cut away with a sharp-edged subtract shape like I did before to create the missing brickwork. I'll use stamp shape with some rectangles and a small amount of soft blend to create this raised brick look. Using paint mode, with surface snap switched on, I paint over the brickwork to give it a weathered look. I use darker tones close to the edges and grooves, where dirt and grime would accumulate over the years. I clone my wall section around the scene, always being careful to look for gaps. Then making sure it doesn't feel too uniform or repeated by making small adjustments to size, position, and angle. When you're ready, move on to the next step. In this step, I'm going to create some giant ribbons to hang between buildings. I'll create a sculpture with a circle subtracted from it, in roughly the position I'd like my fabric to hang, using it as a surface to paint on. Then I'll use paint mode to paint onto the inner curve, trying to keep the stroke straight so it feels like one sheet of fabric. This gives a curve to the stroke that mirrors how a ribbon would hang in real life. Then I can delete the sculpture, leaving the fabric strokes behind to form my decoration. I tint the paint strokes to get a color I like. Now I can tweak the physical properties of the painting. I make it attached at both ends and use the gizmo to tweak the wind direction. I want a bit of wind flutter, so I tweak the floppiness, as well as the wind strength and wind flap frequency to suggest a light breeze. The Dreams engine makes it really simple to get awesome effects like these. I'll clone them around the scene, changing the colors slightly and scaling them to fit the different distances between buildings. I really like how these ribbons have added movement to my scene. Subtle movements within a scene can really bring it to life without doing complex animations. Maybe you can make some other decorations, like flags or hanging fabrics, and tweak their physical properties too. When you're ready, move on to the next step. I'd like to use the staircase I've made to lead us to another area of the scene in a different art style. So far the scene is all happening on one level, so I'll use this as an opportunity to add some style and elevation changes for the player. Creating architecture in a different style is fun for me and for the player. I'll simply use this one piece, repeated across the scene, to create the architecture. It's great how one sculpt asset can be used in such creative ways. Once this part of my scene starts to take shape, I like to tweak the lighting and effects to change its tone and mood. I love how fog interacts with light and adds a glow to an area, lifting shadows, masking less detailed areas, and adding some mystery to the visuals. These lanterns from the collection can be tweaked to look like glowing fire deep within these structures. Tweaking the paint strokes to add glow and intensity to them. So this area actually starts to look more steampunky or industrial, which is fine. It's kind of fun to try and integrate all these random styles. Even when you don't really intend for it to look like that, it's kind of interesting for me to let myself play around with random inputs and ideas. When you're ready, move on to the next step. Now I'm looking at finishing off the scene. I like to use paint mode to add some flourish and detail. Here I'm adding some clouds to bring the sky to life. I'm using the circle's flick and adjusting the tint to give them depth. A trick I have is to clone the cloud and make the copy a darker color. Then I shift the cloud to one side and behind the original, leaving the darker strokes behind, giving a dark rimmed edge. This saves me from having to paint more strokes to create shape. Once I'm happy with the look, I'll clone and scale them around the sky, always moving my camera to get a sense of how they move relative to my buildings. When you're ready, move on to the next step. Here's another technique I like to use for painting objects to use as architecture, using the technique I used earlier of painting onto a sculpture. I start with a cube and flatten it down, scaling it roughly to the size I want the drawing in my scene. I use paint mode with surface snap to create outlines of tall buildings to fill the horizon. The trick here is to use the rectangle as a canvas and then delete it once you're done, leaving your painted strokes behind. Then I can clone and edit the drawings around the scene as I see fit. Scale and color are great ways to make them feel varied and save a lot of time. When you're ready, move on to the next step. So now I think I'm happy with this scene as it is. The scene evolved and changed a lot from what I originally had in mind, and that's great. As an artist, I love seeing how my ideas grow and develop over the course of building a scene. It's always a surprise at the end. For me, the best thing is also that in this process, it made me create a lot of things that I can use for future scenes. I hope you've taken a few insights into how I work, along with some techniques that can be used to give pre-made elements your own flourish. Why not try using my techniques to add polish and personal touch to your own scenes? I can't wait to see what you make. Thanks for watching my masterclass.